I've shared before that military moves force everyone into creating quick community ties so that they can keep their heads above water and feel tethered to their new duty stations, even though they're miles away from the comforts of wherever feels like home. I think the case today really highlights the importance of that new community, where spouses and children are moving to new places and forging new relationships. That new community, if it's safe, can be vital in identifying signs of abuse that would otherwise be hidden or swept under the rug by those frequent disconnections and moves. In this case, a new friendship brought to light the repeated sexual abuse of a young child. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. There is no easy way to tell a story that involves the repeated rape of a child, so this episode may not be the one for you. Totally fair. I'd usually ask that you catch me on the next one, but it serves everyone for me to note right now that the next case I cover includes domestic violence and does mention injury to an infant. I think it's better for everyone to have all the facts as early as possible, so that you can make the choices that work for you. Airman Joshua Lovett married his wife, who we'll call Terry, in 1994. When the two wed, they blended Terry's children from a previous relationship into their new union. Let's call Terry's son Carl and her daughter Melanie. For a few years after their wedding, things continued on copacetically. The family adjusted to their own new rhythms that came to a crashing halt when 7-year-old Melanie finally reported to Terry that Lovett was touching her inappropriately. Melanie had begun to act out and demonstrate a familiarity with sexual terms completely inappropriate for such a young child. She showed boys at her school her genitalia, telling one boy that he should be kissing another young girl's genitals. At a sleepover, Melanie and her friend locked the door and played doctor, using the fake plastic hypodermic needle to pretend to administer a shot again in the genital area. Her friend's mother reported these incidents to Terry, urging Terry to get to the bottom of why Melanie was acting out sexual scenarios. Terry had to navigate asking Melanie if someone was sexually abusing her, who that person might be, and what they may have done. She tried to approach the matter delicately, inquiring whether anyone had ever touched her. Melanie shared that the doctor had touched her, and Terry had to clarify and ask again. Not a doctor, and not in the course of receiving medical care. After further questioning, Melanie told her mother that, quote, Daddy put his private in her tushy and touched her TT. Terry summoned a friend, a witness, and asked Melanie to be honest with her friend and to repeat her disclosure. To the friend, Melanie revealed additional information, and together the three traveled to the emergency room aboard Shaw Air Force Base. A pediatric nurse practitioner performed an exam that corroborated Melanie's story about penetration. Consistent with these medical findings, Terry, and probably the nurse, reported the abuse to the Air Force Office of Special Investigators and provided them a written statement. As Melanie shared more of what Lovett had done to her, a frightening picture began to emerge. Melanie described the abuse starting when she was 5 years old, when Lovett began, quote, sticking his private up Melanie's private. She described the assaults in the bedroom that Lovett shared with her mother and in Lovett's study. She reported pain during the abuse and described Lovett's use of lotion. She said her stepfather told her not to tell anyone, that this was a secret. For 2 years, Melanie endured repeated rape at the hands of her stepfather. Carl, Melanie's brother, testified that Lovett frequently took Melanie into the primary bedroom and into the study. Lovett gave Carl strict instructions not to enter the room when he was alone with Melanie, even if he knocked first. Carl described being on the other side of the door and hearing his sister crying. As the allegations began to come to light, Lovett approached a man we'll call Lawrence. Lovett brought Lawrence a picture of Terry and a copy of her car keys, inquiring how much it would cost to make Terry disappear. It's not clear whether that meant permanently or to generally make Terry unavailable to testify at his trial. Whatever the intention may have been during that meeting, Lovett advanced a theory at his court-martial that he told Lawrence he didn't want Terry physically harmed, but that's something Lawrence didn't remember. The government charged Lovett with solicitation to commit murder, and requested the military judge instruct the panel on the lesser includeds. Lovett pled not guilty and took his case to a contested general court-martial. On July 17, 1999, Lovett was convicted of wrongful possession of Percocet, for which we have no additional details, rape, and soliciting the commission of an offense to the prejudice of good order and discipline. The government argued that Lovett should be confined for a total carceral term of 35 years. Instead, he received a sentence of 15 years confinement, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction from E5 to E1, and a dishonorable discharge. The convening authority approved the sentence as adjudged, but elected to waive 6 months of his total forfeitures for the benefit of Lovett's family, Lovett's victims. If that sounds a bit weird to you because Lovett was charged with, soliciting someone to commit murder, not just some vague and undefined offense, stick with me in the Legal Beagle section. Lovett appealed to the Air Force Court of Criminal Appeals on some ground. The AFCCA filed their opinion in September 2002. Although 2002 was arguably a terrible year for hair health trends, foundation matching, and denim, it is the oldest year that the AFCCA hosts opinions online for. You'll find I linked specifically to their 2002 opinions, unpublished and published, in the show notes. Lovett's case simply isn't there. The best hypothesis that I've come up with is that the AFCCA pulled the opinion down following the Court of Appeal for the Armed Forces publishing their opinion, and, given its age, the 2002 AFCCA opinion was not archived in any of the sites that dredged the internet for court opinions. What we do know is that in 2002, the AFCCA affirmed the factual findings the court made and the sentence. From that 2002 opinion, Lovett further appealed to the Court of Appeal for the Armed Forces, which granted review for 3 issues. CAF evaluated whether the judge erred by admitting hearsay statements from Terry, Melanie, and Terry's friend, and, on the other side of the coin, excluding purportedly exculpatory hearsay evidence Lovett himself offered. Second, they looked to whether the judge erred in the instructions to the panel regarding the maximum allowable sentence, specifically whether life without the possibility of parole, LWOP, was an authorized sentence. As an alternative to that second question, Lovett argued there was insufficient factual evidence to prove that any acts of rape occurred after November 19, 1997. That specific date was important to his argument because life without parole was authorized for crimes like raping a child under 12 years old for offenses committed after November 18, 1997. The third question CAF considered revolved around whether Lovett's conviction for solicitation should be set aside on 3 alternative grounds, First, that it failed to state an offense. Second, that solicitation to commit an offense is not a lesser included of solicitation to commit murder, or, if the first two failed, that there is a fatal variance between the charged specification and the court-martial's finding of fact. If you listened to episode 57, you may know where this is heading. When government counsel requested the military judge instruct the panel on lesser includeds for murder solicitation, the judge instructed them that it must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Lovett intended that Lawrence commit every element of the offense. The judge defined those elements as, first, that at the time and place the government alleged, either Lovett or Lawrence engaged in a specific act for the purpose of wrongfully causing Terry to be unable to appear at a scheduled proceeding, and second, that under the circumstances, Lovett's conduct was to the prejudice of good order and discipline in the armed forces or was of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces. When the panel members returned from deliberations, and I guess consistent with the instruction that they were provided, they'd crossed out murder in the specification and found Lovett guilty of the general disorder of soliciting the commission of an offense to the prejudice of good order and discipline. They predicated that finding on the findings that Lovett wrongfully solicited Lawrence to cause Terry to disappear or to prevent her from appearing at a proceeding. They specifically cited to Lovett providing Lawrence with the keys to Terry's car, a photo by which to identify her, and discussing what her disappearance would cost. It's not clear from the opinions what the going rate of murder or disappearing somebody in the late 90s was. The problem, of course, was that charging someone with murder solicitation is vastly different than charging someone with soliciting witness tampering. On appeal, Lovett argued that he prepared a defense against soliciting murder, but that the panel accepting the murder and making it just soliciting the commission of a crime transformed it into a crime he didn't prepare a defense for, and perhaps couldn't prepare a defense for because the modification was made in the deliberation room. So when the panel came back and found Lovett guilty of wrongfully soliciting Lawrence to cause Terry to disappear or otherwise prevent her from appearing at the trial or some other hearing, they functionally found Lovett guilty of soliciting the obstruction of justice. And because obstructing justice and murder are so foundationally different, CAF agreed that Lovett was deprived of the opportunity to meaningfully defend against the charge, which means the variance was fatal. With that fatal variance in mind, CAF set aside Lovett's conviction for solicitation and remanded the matter to the AFCCA to either reassess the sentence themselves or order a sentence rehearing. They decided that because they affirmed as to the first question and reversed as to the third, they need not address the second question about life without parole and or the sufficiency of the proof that any of the rapes took place after November 19, 1997. Although we don't have access to that early AFCCA opinion, they apparently did elect to make some specific factual finding that some of Lovett's rapes took place after that date. That struck me as a little bit odd, an appellate court serving as a fact finder. But the military courts have always had slightly different standards than what I'm accustomed to, and do sometimes take steps that are non-traditional in the civilian world. Lovett argued that the AFCCA should order a sentence rehearing, asserting they would struggle to determine what the court below would have imposed absent the conviction for solicitation. They disagreed. They concluded the repeated rape was the gravamen of Lovett's criminal behavior, not the solicitation, and adjusted his sentence from 15 years of confinement to 14 years of confinement, and otherwise affirmed the sentence. But don't go anywhere, because there's more. I know I said we were clearly missing something, namely details, when we didn't get that early AFCCA opinion. But that wasn't really all that clear until CAF's 2006 opinion. After the AFCCA reassessed his sentence, Lovett again appealed to CAF. He reasserted that LWUP question and made a novel argument, asserting he was subjected to cruel and unusual punishment while in post-trial confinement. But the thing I was most surprised by was the 2006 opinion's casual note that Lovett was also originally charged with solicitation to plant crack cocaine. That's what made it extraordinarily evident that we are absolutely missing details. I imagine the goal was to discredit either Terry or perhaps her friend, but any explanation we come up with is just a guess. It was pretty easy for CAF to deal with the issue of whether LWOP was an authorized punishment after November 18, 1997, by concluding that it was. Because it was an authorized punishment, they didn't have to consider whether the original military judge erred in his instruction to the panel, especially because the AFCCA made that specific finding about the dates, which again is sort of weird for an appellate court to do. But CAF concluded that even if the AFCCA goofed in their review, it ultimately didn't matter. Whether life without parole was an authorized punishment didn't actually matter, even though everyone spent half a decade fighting about it, and that's because the maximum punishment for the repeated rape of a child before November 18, 1997 was a life sentence. Whether that's a life sentence or a life sentence without parole, Lovett didn't receive either. He received a sentence of 15 years, which got dropped to 14, so any error in describing his maximum exposure was harmless. But Lovett also made that extra claim in his second round with CAF, arguing that he deserved additional confinement credits because he was forced to endure oppressive, dangerous, and unsanitary conditions that violated his Eighth Amendment rights to be free from cruel and unusual punishment. He said that his confinement in the older section of the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, his confinement between July 23, 1999 and September 30, 2002, merited relief. In support of that contention, he asserted that his cell was only 4 feet wide by 12 feet long and 7.5 feet tall, that there was inadequate ventilation during periods of extreme temperatures, that pieces of the wall and ceilings, which I'm extrapolating to mean plaster, would fall and strike him, that there were rodents in the dining facility, that sewage backed up in the dining facility during heavy rain, that there was lead-based paint on the walls and ceilings in his cell, presumably also falling and striking him too, that there was asbestos covering the pipes in the dry cleaning facility where Lovett worked, that the dry cleaning facility conditions created a risk of electrocution, that he was subjected to lockdowns that weren't his fault, during which his food was bad and he wasn't permitted to exercise, and, finally, that the water in his cell available for drinking was high in both lead and iron. I can't speak for most of these conditions, but I can confirm that if you complain about iron levels in your water to military officials, even military family housing officials, they won't be all that impressed or motivated to act, even if your water is straight up brown and you're in the early stages of a global pandemic. My own vendettas aside, the government contested the facts within Lovett's submissions, and CAF concluded that even if all those facts that Lovett alleged were true, they would not entitle him to relief. They reasoned that the Eighth Amendment prohibited punishment incompatible with the evolving standards of decency in a maturing society, and punishments involving unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. CAF observed that the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice, had never been modified to afford greater protection than the Eighth Amendment, so they limited their review to whether his confinement conditions fell into either of those two categories. To rise to the military justice system's test for violations of the Eighth Amendment, Lovett would need to show first an objectively sufficiently serious act or omission resulting in the denial of necessities. Second, a culpable state of mind on the part of the prison officials, amounting to deliberate indifference to Lovett's health and safety. And third, that he'd exhausted his grievance system. To be clear, that's a conjunctive and. Lovett would need to prove all three. CAF concluded that even if Lovett was denied necessities, and even if he'd exhausted the grievance system, he didn't establish deliberate indifference to his health and safety. CAF declined to speculate about which prison officials knew of the conditions Lovett specifically was exposed to, or what conclusions those prison officials could draw based on their knowledge. For what it's worth, I think it would take incredibly diligent record-keeping and reporting in order to be able to prove up a claim like this, and I don't know if that's something we can reasonably expect an incarcerated individual to complete. But let's zoom back in a little bit. In support of his claim, Lovett submitted a copy of the American Correctional Association Visiting Committee report for the disciplinary barracks, which found 100% compliance with 41 mandatory standards and non-compliance with 10 out of the 424 non-mandatory standards. I don't know where Lovett's asserted deficiencies fell on the list of mandatory or non-mandatory standards. It's not clear whether providing lead-free water in a cell is mandatory or just suggested, and there's nothing in the opinion from CAF that discloses which facts the government specifically challenged with additional evidence. Taken all together, which is of course our only option, it's challenging to discern how much credence to give Lovett's assertions about the conditions of his confinement, and harder still to offer some kind of opinion from the sidelines. After that final 2006 opinion from CAF affirming the AFCCA's 14-year sentence, the trail goes cold. But that opinion probably came out pretty close in time to when Lovett, with good behavior, may have been released from Fort Leavenworth. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com or on conductunbecomingpod.com. Join me next time when we weigh the value of uncharged conduct. Until then, take care. Conduct Unbecoming is a podcast where I get to talk about interesting crimes and cases that involve U.S. military service members. I research, write, and produce the podcast myself. The opinions expressed are my own, and perhaps it's obvious. Conduct Unbecoming is not approved, authorized, or endorsed by the Department of Defense.